Hello, welcome to Network Collective, a video podcast with network engineers and IT pros discussing the technical and business challenges we face day to day in our professional lives. We're glad you're here. Today, we're talking about the unique challenges of working in SMB. SMB meaning small and medium-sized businesses. We're joined today by three awesome guests, Kevin Blackburn, John Duprey, and Matt Haedo, each of whom have some really great insight into this topic, so we're excited that they're here. For those of you watching on the live stream, please feel free to also participate on Twitter using hashtag Network Collective. You can post questions, make comments. We're a community-focused podcast, so we really value your contribution as well. So let's take a moment now and go around the virtual roundtable and introduce our guests. So Kevin, why don't we start with you?
Hey guys, I'm Kevin Blackburn. I'm currently a senior network engineer in the healthcare industry. If you want to reach out to me on Twitter, at the routing table, and my website is theroutingtable.com. I'll be happy to hear from you.
Awesome. Thanks, Kevin. So I actually met Kevin just a month or so ago at Networking Field Day 15. So we're new friends. And Kevin, I'm really glad you're with us today. Next, we have John Duprey. John, why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Hey guys, I'm John Duprey. I work at an MSP as a senior systems engineer. I had the pleasure of working with Phil a bunch of years ago. We had some fun projects and things that we upgraded networks and installed servers. You can reach out to me on LinkedIn.
Awesome. Thanks, John. Yeah, John and I did work together for a few years at an MSP, but the cool part was that we actually specialize in SMB. So I happen to know that John has some really great breadth of knowledge and depth of insight in specifically this topic. So John, I'm really glad to be working with you again, even if it's just for a day. And last, but certainly not least, my good friend Matt Haedo. Matt, why don't you tell us a little about yourself today?
Hey, Phil. First of all, thanks for having me here. My name's Matt Haedo. I currently work for Avar. We service companies of all sizes, from SMB to mid-market to enterprise, primarily mid-market, but I got my start working for an MSP that did quite a bit of SMB work, so glad to be here.
Awesome.
You guys can find me on Twitter at Matt Haedo or packetflow.io.
Awesome. Thanks, Matt. And of course, I'm joined by my great co-hosts, Yvonne Sharp and Jordan Martin, who I happen to know also have some really great insight into this topic from our previous discussions. So let's just jump right in. Working in technology is challenging for anybody, right? SMB, large businesses, web scale, service provider, whatever you like. But working specifically in the small and medium-sized business, which is our focus today, has some kind of specific challenges that we're going to focus on with regard to technology, business requirements, budget, maybe in-house engineering needs. What else am I missing? Ongoing support. But before we really dig into that, how do you all here define that term, small and medium-sized business, SMB? What does that actually mean to you?
Well, for me, we have kicked around the metric of just company size, which can be helpful. It doesn't tell all. For me, I think of any organization that maybe has a few more generalized jack of all trades IT folks, or maybe a most technical, non-technical person, but they don't have a huge budget or, a huge staff to maintain their infrastructure.
Okay. Yeah, you brought up a couple more points, the staff and the budget factors, which I definitely want to dig into as well.
And I think it's important, Phil, to make the distinction. You always hear enterprise, your 30,000 user organizations or 10,000 or whatever that number might be. And then there's SMB. But I feel that when you talk about SMB and enterprise, you really need to look at the mid-market as well, because there's such a huge gap between that 10 to 30,000 user organization and the 10 to 50 user, or wherever you draw that line, SMB.
Yeah, we can even throw Soho into there, right? I mean, there are offices with, 12 people making millions of dollars a year in revenue, right? And they still count. So I think there's definitely a lot of, and they need infrastructure. So there's definitely a lot going here. I know, and one of you guys correct me if I'm wrong, but Cisco defines SMB as really big numbers. I don't know what they are, but it's in the thousands. Am I right?
I think so.
Yeah.
I mean, I've heard that the you know cutoff point being anywhere from 250 to 1,000. I think Cisco might be 1,000, which to me just seems kind of crazy because I see that as firmly in the mid-market. If we're going to go by user counts, I'd say in my experience, anything past, depending on their data needs, usually 200 to 300 is your cutoff point.
Well, what do you mean by data needs? What is it? I don't know.
So I can have a 300 user organization versus a 50 user organization, and based upon what that 50 user organization is doing, they might need a lot more infrastructure, and they might have much greater availability needs. So the 300 user organization, they can tolerate downtime of, let's say, a day until they get their systems back up and running, where that 50 user organization, they simply can't. They're going to have active data centers or active standby data centers. They're going to have a much greater needs for technology than the larger organization.
Okay.
Yeah.
So the business critical systems and that kind of thing. Yeah, go ahead, John.
Smaller businesses sometimes don't even have their own infrastructure. They'll rely on Box or Dropbox to store their files, so they can't even tolerate any downtime, because if they can't get to their files, then they can't get any work done.
Well, that's an interesting point. So the opposite. So, we have a small infrastructure because we have a small organization, and therefore things are not as mission critical maybe, but you get down to the really small level where they just dump everything into Dropbox Teams or whatever it is, right?
Yep.
Then you rely completely on that even little bit of infrastructure. Yeah, that's a good point. I didn't even think of that.
I don't even think that has to do with size. I've seen larger organizations start going that direction, just from a management perspective. I think it's one of these things that's really hard to nail down, because it doesn't really matter which metric you use. There's always exceptions. There's always something outside of the box.
I think we got some good good factors to look at, though. We did talk about end user count, type of technology, high availability factors, that sort of thing.
Yeah, so I think it really comes down to perspective. It comes down to how important is IT to the organization, right? And we want to define it by number, or a number of people, the amount spent, number of total employees. I don't know that it gets defined that well, because I've seen some small shops where IT is absolutely critical and they treat it that way.
Yeah.
And I would not call them SMBs at all, because they're running advanced technology and they're working, with things that the big shops are. Mm-hmm. And then I've seen, big shops that definitely operate like SMBs, like, 2,000 people organizations that operate as an SMB.
Yeah.
I'd absolutely drop them in that category. So I can see where Cisco would make that determination, even into the thousands.
So Jordan, when you say they operate like the bigger companies that operate like SMBs, what exactly do you mean by that? Like, as far as how much they care, or the emphasis they put on infrastructure?
Care is probably the wrong word. Yeah. It's just their willingness to invest in things like resiliency. The idea that, if I have something that I consider critical, but I'm unwilling to make it duplicate, to me, that's an SMB mentality. Yeah. If your management can look at something and say, hey, I absolutely need this. Yeah. And then won't put a couple extra $1,000 to make it redundant, you're operating like an SMB.
And I think you kind of hit the nail on the head with SMB mentality, because you can have two companies which are essentially the same. The systems are just as critical, and one is willing to spend the money to protect them as if they were critical systems, and the other is willing to take the risk to not do so. And it's that sort of SMB mentality which really separates the infrastructure that they're implementing even more than the systems themselves.
I also want to make a key point here, and when I say SMB mentality, I don't want it to sound like there's some negative connotation that comes with that. Yeah. I think naturally that we kind of, especially those of us who work at maybe larger enterprise shops, you hear that and it's kind of like, oh, yeah, it's this little SMB guys. But it's not that at all, right? Some shops, it's absolutely appropriate for you to be running single home systems, and it makes sense for the business, and that's a very valid business decision. You've looked at your risk versus what you're willing to invest, and you're willing to make those trade-offs, and that's a responsible decision. Now, you're still operating like an SMB, but it's still a responsible way to go about it. And so it's not a negative connotation. I want to make that clear. It's just in the perspective of the way you look at your technology. How important is it to your business, and how much are you willing to spend?
Yeah, in the context of budget and money, that's what I completely hear what you're saying. Yeah. I mean, I can think of so many examples that John Duprey and I, working for customer X and customer Y, where like nothing could be down, and we'd get a flurry of help desk tickets if something didn't work quite right, or if there was a little ugliness on the phone line. But you don't have any backups? Well, we won't spend $1. John, I gotta say this one. I'm not gonna say the name of the customer, but I remember I was in Saratoga Springs, and I'm working with a customer, some nice folks. They were setting up a new office, expanding, doing some cool things, and I'm sitting with somebody high up in the company in a conference room, and there were issues. John, do you know who I'm talking about?
Oh, I remember.
Okay. And I'm sitting across the table in this conference room, and the guy, nice guy, and we're shooting the breeze, talking about technology, some plans for the next steps, and a very serious problem that they faced, and it needed to be solved. Technical problem, right? And he looks at me, and he gets quiet, and he goes like this. Okay, Phil, what can you do to fix this problem that won't cost me more than $1? And I just looked at it, and I'm like, pray, I guess? You can start with that. I mean, I don't know. And that we had a lot of laughs when we got back to the office. But that was an eye-opener, because it was definitely a budget constraint that was clearly not the technical challenge, but it was the professional challenge that we had to get through. How do I still provide this technical solution to meet this business requirement within a very, very small budget? And that's where we started to look at specific types of vendors. I know John and I put in a lot of sonic walls instead of ASAs, as an example. And what'd you say?
I said I'm not proud of that.
Oh.
Coming from the guy who had to migrate all those configs back to ASAs, we're gonna have to talk later.
Yeah.
Well, and one of the things about the guy coming to you and saying, "What can you do to solve this problem for me for $1?" And maybe for me, it was like the professional stage I was in, and not so much a lack of maturity and a willingness to please. But there are times that you've just got to say that is not going to work, and I think that is one of the big things that I learned when I was in the SMB space. But I had a tendency to take too much ownership of those problems, and to not see it as a business organizational challenge, but to see it as a personal failure. Like, we didn't have backups. Well, the reason you don't have backups is because they wouldn't pay for backups.
Yeah.
And you can't you can do some simple things with shadow copies or with things, but those aren't backup solutions. And so there are times when you just can't pull the data out of your hat.
Yeah.
And for me, it took a while for me to learn not to own that so personally.
Yeah, hearing Phil's story, it makes me cringe, because I also, I came out of an SMB shop.
It made me cringe too.
Right, and well, I mean, but you were there in a consultative fashion, right?
Yes,
so I mean,
that's right.
I'm thinking about sitting there as being the guy who's responsible for this, and having management have those types of requirements. How can we do this for absolutely zero money? And I'm just like, and I think about those days when I was trying my best, right? I'm really, so for me, SMB was early on, like that's where I cut my teeth.
Yep.
And I think that's probably a pretty common story. But for me, I'm cutting my teeth. I'm trying to learn how to do things right. I'm trying to figure out how to be a good, network engineer, and I'm being stopped by my management from doing what is right for the business by the technical definition. Now, since then, I've matured a bit, and I've learned that sometimes what's right for the business from the technical definition isn't always what's right for the business from the business decision. And there are more factors to the decision than what the best technical solution is. But man, that just drove me crazy.
Yep.
Like, this needs to be up 100% of the time. I'm going to give you $10 to do it.
Yeah.
You mentioned that SMB mindset, and I agree that that's not necessarily a bad thing, but I think what we started talking about immediately after was, almost the IT doesn't matters mindset. IT doesn't matter, and I did see a little bit more overlap in the SMB space, where there just wasn't that willingness to do what needed to be done. And I'm not talking about, we're not going to spend $100,000 on X appliance. I'm talking about we've got a switch which is the fan is caked with dust and it's above the third ceiling tile to the left, and that's running everything.
That sounds awfully specific, Matt. Is this recalling from memory?
I think you've probably seen that same ceiling tile,
yes,
Phil.
I
We've
have.
all seen that ceiling tile.
I've seen worse, yeah.
And that might be a
But it was
20-user
really
shop. That
the
might be a
fourth
300
ceiling
user.
tile.
Yeah.
He's trying to protect the identity. So
Protect the identity.
I do have to say that all my most, like, not all, but the majority of my fondest memories as a technical person were working in SMB with SMB customers. And I think this is why, and this is just my philosophy off the cuff, just kind of coming off the top of my head. I like the technology that we work with, right? I like figuring out solutions to problems, and I have a slight of a distaste in just spending money on gear and boxes to solve a problem. I like figuring out how can I make this work with what we got. That requires the skill, it's the challenge, it's fulfilling. So I really enjoyed it a lot of the time. As much of a pain in the neck that it was sometimes, I don't know.
I agree with you there. I think, on that level, enterprise could learn a lot from SMB, where you're genuinely, and there's been a lot of talk recently with engineering solutions versus just deploying boxes. And I feel like when you do get to a certain level, and there is a little bit more budget, sometimes there tends to be less focus on doing the right thing and right-sizing solutions. I think you might have even written a post about, right-sizing your network infrastructure or something to that effect. And that is a lot more common in SMB, and I feel like the truly consultative relationship with the customer is often there a little bit more in that environment, just because the budget isn't there and you genuinely do have to craft a solution that fits, rather than say, okay, here's the CVD, we're going to buy this, and this. Do you need it? No, but we're going to make more money, and here's what we're going to implement. So not to say there isn't a balance between the two, but
it does sound like budget is definitely a driving factor to a lot of this conversation right now. I didn't necessarily mean it to be, but it does sound like it's the current that's pushing a lot of these decisions. Go ahead,
One
Evil.
of the things I loved about SMB, though, was I knew who made the decision. And I could walk in his office and I could say, this is what I think we need to do, and this is why, and I could have a conversation with the person who decided. And I might win or I might lose, but sometimes in the enterprise, who makes the decision is so convoluted, and you've got purchasing, and you've got management approval, and you've got vendor relationships, and you've got politics. We had a very wise man tell us once that bigger dogs have more fleas, and that's kind of sometimes what it's like to be in a large organization. And so for me, the ability to go in and make an argument and make it passionately with the person who made the decision was the end all and be all. That was one of the things that I loved about that environment.
I do have a question. We're talking a lot about money and being able to make the decisions to do the right things, and I think it might be a topic that gets investigated further. But I just wonder if the concept of operational funding is much more attractive to SMB. So when we talk about things like AWS and cloud, and when we talk about infrastructure as a service, software as a service, I mean, do those things become more palatable because they're less of a big upfront capital investment? Do you think it's the big outlay up front that's the problem, or do you think it's just the cost overall?
A lot of times it's the upfront cost when a customer is looking at a solution. If we propose like a couple servers to replace their aging equipment, they're going to say, well, can we just do it with one or something like that? And it's like, yeah, you can, but then you don't have any high availability. There's but then like some of the customers, they'll go with financing or they'll lease the equipment, just to get over that whole like upfront cost, the initial investment.
I think even beyond that, though, it's the cost to maintain going forward. You put the high-level gear in up front. You have a company, they finally decide, we're going to pay the money, we're going to get the good gear in here, new servers, whatever it takes. But they have a contractor come in and do it. Well, who do I have on staff that's even going to look after that going forward? So I think, budget is a big thing. I don't think it's focused in one area being the upfront, the maintenance. It's kind of the whole package, if you put it that way.
The whole package being ongoing support at that point. So we have 53 people. We're a law firm with 20 lawyers and 30 support staff, and then something else. Are we able to afford the high-level network engineer and VMware admin and all these things in a 50-person company with $20 million a year revenue? I mean, when you look at it as a percentage of budget, what we're we know what our monthly revenue is, so we don't want to spend a $4 million on a capital project, but we can spend, $5,000 a month on AWS or something like that. We just don't have the internal engineering staff, we can't afford it, or we don't want to pay for it to do it. And I think that's really common in the SMB, is that they're kind of in this no man's land where you have a lot of the same needs. Because I really think that a lot of the business drivers and then therefore the technical requirements that flow from them are very similar. You have a 50-person law firm, I'll stick with that example. You're closing deals, you're closing loans, maybe you're working for a bank, or you got major cases going on, even though you're not a huge organization. So there's still a lot of money at stake. You still have email as the lifeblood of the organization. In a medical practice with 50 doctors, small, but you still have to get to that, what are those called? EMRs? Whatever, the medical records thing, right? You still got to get to that. That's the lifeblood. So I really feel like a lot of those business drivers are the same. Maybe not all, because it's really expensive to eliminate all your single points of failure, for example, right? So there's a little bit more tolerance for downtime, but I really feel like there's a lot of overlap there.
Well, I've seen a concerted effort.
No, go ahead, Jordan.
All right, I've seen a concerted effort from those in SMB to build in back in non-technical systems.
What do you mean?
So if you say an EMR is a good example in a hospital. Almost every hospital that I know has a way to go to paper. It's painful, and no one wants to do it, but you can. And so there's always a backup, and I think that gives a bit more leniency to the idea that we don't have to have a fully redundant technical system. We don't need 100% uptime because we have this way to fall back into something that's non-technical. We don't have to live and die by the operation of our network.
And that'll have to be good enough, because that's the budget, and it fulfills the compliance requirements. So yeah, I get that. What do you guys see as specific technology, equipment that you would say is more unique and specific to the SMB world? I'm thinking about maybe vendor brands. I'm thinking about different types of hypervisors, things like that. What do you see as more common and prolific in the SMB world?
VMware is definitely out there, and Hyper-V. We've got a few customers that use Hyper-V. VMware, they don't go usually higher than like standard licensing. Everything's down to like Essentials or Essentials Plus if they want the high availability features.
Okay.
Like some Dell switches or Cisco switches, maybe HP. It really just depends on what they're looking for and what technology they need. Layer 2, Layer 3, that sort of stuff.
Yeah. Do you still see that like virtualization, for example, is something that you're deploying even in small companies?
Yes,
is a standard
totally.
practice in big. Is it? Okay.
Yeah, I mean, like they'll have like a lot of different services, and generally speaking, when you set up a Windows server, it's supposed to be single, like a single service, like a domain controller or a file server. So you want to have all these things, but you don't want to have a physical server for each one, so you can just compartmentalize it all in VMware, and you can throw them all in the same box if you fill it up with enough memory and CPU.
Yeah. So it does make sense.
Internal storage, I think that's another big difference there. Is your typical SMB, I'm going to have 1, 2, maybe 3 ESXi hosts. I'm going to have a whole bunch of servers. Each one is going to have internal storage. They're going to run the most basic licensing, if not free ESXi. And the availability just won't be there. Whereas when you move into mid-market enterprise, then you're going to be looking at actual enterprise plus clusters and SAN or hyperconverged, rather than just your basic HP server with internal storage doing nothing but being a single server. Yeah.
I remember one time where when I set up a call manager phone system, and the company was still working out their storage platform, what they were going to do there. John and I worked on this one.
They still have it.
Okay. At the time, that was the plan. But I still put the phone system in, and I did not set up DRS because I couldn't find the room to send these files, which I ended up doing after the fact, right? And guess what happened right after DRS being disaster recovery system or service, whatever the S stands for.
SRST?
Not SRST, specifically within Call Manager. I did have SRST running, thankfully, because guess what happened the day after I put it into production? Problem. That particular UC 220, I believe, I don't remember the model. They had problems with it had problems with their RAID cards, and you could only afford one box, That was the budget, and I couldn't find space because the whole web of technology all works together. And they went down, and thankfully SRST took over on the voice gateway router. But that was a specific challenge that I faced. Was all right. How do we get the phones are very, very important. How do we get some kind of a backup going here? Since they chose to go over to voice over IP.
Didn't we set up OpenFiler?
We ended up finding a solution. Right, and that's my point. Is that we had to figure out how are we going to make this work for less than $1. Different customer, but that was the idea. And I think that's a challenge that I faced a lot. Is how do I meet this same business requirement with what I got?
I think in the SMB space, we end up going to more creative solutions than looking for ones that cost money.
I mean, I want to agree, but I've had conversations like with Jordan, for example, where he's telling me about how he's setting up, active data centers and things, and I'm like, that's pretty creative, and how he's making that work so that there's DNS failover and there's layer 2 adjacencies going across. So that sounds pretty creative too. But
don't say that too loudly. There's a lot of people who won't be a fan of data center connect.
Right. Yeah. Well, I remember you mentioning something recently, and
I don't get to make all the decisions.
Yes. But my point is that you still have to make it. You have to make it work with what you got, and even then there's a budget. Those big routers, the big iron is really expensive. So it's like, we got to get our perimeter secure. Well, the type of firewalls you need cost $30,000 a pop. Well, that's our entire budget. So even larger enterprises, I need 20 firewalls. Well, that kills your entire IT budget for the year. So even enterprises deal with that as well.
Now, are we talking enterprise or are we talking mid-market? Because you can do active data centers. I mean, what can you put in a server these days? A terabyte of RAM? So let's say in each data center you have 3 servers with a terabyte of RAM each and a single SAN. Some would say that that's not enterprise. I don't even have a full rack of gear in each server, so I feel like there's this line where it's not quite enterprise, but you're still doing some pretty complex technologies and doing creative solutions.
Well, I don't think there's any line where creativity stops. And to be quite honest, I think that's an unfortunate thing in our industry.
Yeah.
We have too many special snowflakes, and we shouldn't have so much creativity. We should have standard deployments. And I'll get off my soapbox now.
Yeah.
But the reality is that the creativity doesn't end. I'm dealing with a customer in the past couple of weeks where we run into a problem. They bought gear. They had X amount of budget. And we run into a fact that what they bought doesn't support a particular feature. Now, this is a large customer. They spent a lot of money. And guess what? We're being really creative, even though they're big, because they don't have any more money in that budget to go buy a router to go do what they need to do that the switch won't do. So I don't think creativity ever stops.
You got to be honest with me. You're having a ton of fun, though, aren't you?
On that one, no.
Okay,
on some of them, yes. Yeah.
So, but I think when you talk about creativity, are we talking about creativity as in cutting corners, or are we talking about actual engineering? Because at the same time, I agree that there's too many snowflakes and that complexity is the enemy of stability. But at the same time, if we're just going off of a vendor white paper and buying exactly what I'm told I need to buy, and you eliminate that creativity altogether, you eliminate a lot of the engineering component, and I feel like you're not really doing the right thing for the customer. So it's a fine line, right, between just deploying something as it's written and truly crafting the right solution for that customer.
Well, a lot of times you're not putting in an entire stack of equipment at once. Like, you're going to replace pieces at a time, put in new servers here, put in new switches there. So sometimes those switches might be a little outdated. They may not support the same functionality that you're expecting. So then you got to make your ASA do router on a stick.
Ooh.
That was standard deployment when I was doing SMB. It was your typical infrastructure was an HP. I'll just bring out a bunch of vendors. You had an HP 1810G, or several of them, layer 2 switches connected to an ASA 5505 or a Sonic wall, whatever.
Oh, I've seen those before.
Oh yeah, and all your layer 3 routing is done through the ASA. If you can, because you might not even have Security Plus on it, in which case you're not really doing too much layer 3 anything, because you can't.
Or
you can in a very limited capacity.
You mean networks need routers? Like, is that a thing?
No, they don't, because you have a single flat, 192, 168,
Not really.
1.0/24. Who needs to route that? Just route it outbound and you're good.
You got your
And
router
you've
on a
got
stick,
NAT,
right?
so you're safe,
Oh,
right?
yeah.
Yep.
I want to go back to what John said earlier, though. I think the creativity part really involves taking a look at the gear that you already have, and instead of saying, I want to do X, Y, and Z, what parts do I need to make that happen? It's more, I want to do X, Y, and Z. How do I configure what I already have to make that happen?
So-
and I think that's why, you see that more in the small biz side of it because they don't have the option to buy more gear.
But we're going here, so I'm going to get back up on my soapbox here for a second.
Go for it.
And Matt, what you said is absolutely right. Complexity, right, and creativity is at direct odds with stability and predictability. And so every time we put in one of these creative little fun little solutions where we can pat ourselves on the back because of how smart and clever we were, we make it nearly impossible for the next guy to come in and support that thing. And so I am a huge fan. Now, I mean, I understand that there are all kinds of competing priorities, and I don't put this on the shoulders of the engineers at the SMB level because sometimes their hands are tied. You just have to do it. That's what we're talking about. But we shouldn't be happy about it. We shouldn't be celebrating the fact that we're putting in snowflake solutions that don't fit the industry standard. And I'm not even talking about the vendor, white paper for the way that you do it, but I've seen crazy things done with protocols to make things work that should never have worked. Yeah. It should never have done it that way. Static MAC addresses out, tons of trunks to avoid multicast. Like crazy stuff. Yep. And it's like, why are you doing that? Because it makes it impossible for the next person to come in and do something successful. When you need to update that core switch that has those crazy MAC addresses in there, guess what? That upgrade is going to have problems. Yeah, I guarantee it. It doesn't matter how smart the guy is who's doing it. It's going to have problems because they don't understand what you did. And so I know it's not really on topic. And again, soapbox, maybe back off.
But there's another side of that too. And I'm thinking more in the security space, right? There are some incredible open source tools like Bro IDS, like Security Onion, like they're really solid open source tools that you can use to get some of that functionality. Snort, where a large enterprise might be willing to go pay hundreds of thousands of dollars for that functionality to get the support along with it, but you can mimic some of that functionality with some open source tools. Now granted, and this, I don't know, this may be heresy, but some of those security tools are more for visibility and monitoring. If your Linux box has a heart attack and falls over, you're not going to impact production, right? But you are going to get lots of really beneficial features out of it. And I think that space, like the Linux space and things like that, are some places where you can do some really neat stuff, but not bring the network to its knees with your creativity.
That was completely in reference to into designing infrastructure.
Right.
And when it comes to open source software and doing creative things in software, I mean, if you can get a tool that does what you need it to do, fantastic. I will caution this though. It's a cautionary story from one of my customers. I won't name who it is. They inherited a company, and when they inherited this company, this guy had built this really, really clever Linux firewall at the middle of their network. You talk about firewall routing.
John, was this you?
No.
No.
This sounds
but
like
I mean,
something. Yeah.
Completely open source firewall, and the thing worked. The thing worked beautifully until you had to unwind it and figure out how to pull this out and put something to replace it, because it's not going to last forever. Yeah. And so while the software was really, really clever, because it sat in the infrastructure and it was complicated, that acquisition happened, I think, 2 years ago, and they still have it in place. And they have a smart team. It's one of my smartest customers that I'm talking about here, and they can't successfully unwind it without causing downtime. And so they pretty much have just been, we'll work around it.
With regards to open source, a lot of times you hear free as in beer versus free as in speech, right? Open source being free as in speech. And I think one piece that a lot of people often miss is when you deploy, and I'm a huge fan of open source software. I've been working with Linux since I was 12 and FreeBSD shortly after, and I think there's a lot of value there. That being said, when you look at open source software, I see it as free as in puppy, because it's free, but you're going to need to maintain it. And that's, once again, that's not a bad thing if you're willing to invest in your engineering resources, in your staff. If you have people that are actually able to design a custom solution and support it, then by all means do so. But I saw a lot of times that didn't happen. You'd have the open filer box in the corner, which didn't really scale as well as we thought it was going. No, I'm not picking on you, Phil, but it didn't really scale as well as we thought it was going to. And 10 years later, who knows what it's doing? And there's been a whole bunch of band-aids in place, and there's no vendor support. So that's something we could argue all day about. Is vendor support worth it? But in certain circumstances, just having a clearly documented migration path, an upgrade path, and support path, there is a lot of value there when the company itself isn't willing to invest in their own IT team.
Yeah, I did find that, thinking about what Yvonne said before about you're able in an SMB to go right to the decision maker, sometimes even just the very owner of the company. But I don't think ever, when I was working with SMB customers, was the owner of a company, or was the company at all, an IT company. So the owner of the company had no idea. And therefore IT, though that person was the owner, the decision maker, I had direct access sitting across a conference table, there was a lack of understanding of what things cost. I remember saying, well, this is what a 2901 router costs for your voice gateway. We're going to use it for your voice and data. And they choked on that cost. That's incredible. That's too much money. Well, that's a small router. That's not expensive. And so I think there was a lack of understanding there, and that was a challenge that I faced. That though I did have access to the decision maker, which was awesome because you were able to get a decision.
Sometimes
a lot of the time
it was no.
A lot of the time it was an uphill battle because they didn't get it, and so now I work with IT managers who are the decision makers, internally, for example, where I work, and they understand it, though there's still budget to deal with and things like that, from on high. So, what would you guys consider a definition and then examples of enterprise grade equipment? Because we were talking about different vendors, and Matt, you mentioned support, for example. So what do you think?
Something
what
with
does that
4-hour support.
Okay.
Is that the definition if I can get 4-hour support on it? A lot of that's based off a location, though, so that's not necessarily the gear.
So
well, what if I had 4-hour support on the Netgear?
About vendor support, and I'm guilty in doing so myself, because we've all had certain experiences don't live up to what we think we're paying for. But I have also had experiences where there's a bug, or there's a loop in the network, or there's something. My CPU's at 99%, my core switch is down, and guess what? I can troubleshoot pretty well, but I work with too many platforms to know the exact platform-specific command to dig into whatever this issue is. Mm-hmm. So I call in, and I talk to an engineer that does nothing but work with this one platform.
Yeah.
They work with the pizza box switch or the chassis switch, and that's all they do. And they dig in there, and they fix it. And I think there's a lot of value in being able to have your network up and running pretty quickly.
Yeah. Yeah. So what would you consider some, you could focus on networking or anything else, but what would you consider SMB networking vendors as opposed to enterprise class gear?
I think it's harder to determine a vendor, because you can put Cisco gear in at all places. They sort of have something across all the price points. I mean, Meraki, in my mind, is a more SMB focused solution, but for me, there are certain things that are clearly not small business oriented. Things like Prime Infrastructure, things like Tetration, things like some of those more advanced tools. And not even really advanced, but non-core functionality tools. They're just not an option, but because of cost.
Okay. Yeah. So again, cost is a big factor again. So I hear that. Now, what has been your experiences with support from salespeople, your account managers, when you had experiences with SMB, whether you were, that was your customer or you worked in an SMB?
I'll chime in.
Was that the account managers weren't even really in play in the SMB. It's more, you're going to buy from your MSP who's getting their gear from, Tech Data or whoever else, or you're going to buy from CDW directly, and there isn't there isn't that much focus on the relationship between, AM or account executive and the customer. It's more just buying direct. And some of the vendors, my background was, I was taught very early on to be as vendor neutral as possible. And genuinely, you don't want to be a shill for a specific vendor. You want to really evaluate the right solution for the customer. So I try not to bash vendors, but you asked. So here
I
we
did.
go. I would see a typical SMB. We would have, SonicWall makes some great products. I didn't like working with them. So we'd have a SonicWall at the edge. Once again, it's the right tool for the job in certain situations. Just hopefully it's not the job that I'm working on, because I hate them. So we'd have a SonicWall at the edge. We would have an unmanaged switch. Whatever vendor that might be downstream, it's unmanaged. It's not doing layer 3. We would have. This is going to be somewhat controversial because they're often the right tool for the job in SMB. We would have a lot of Unify access points by Ubiquity. Once again, phenomenal product for the price for a certain use case, but often I would see them put into a use case where it might not be the most appropriate.
Mm-hmm.
I apologize to any one of you vendors out there. They all make great products which all serve a very a specific use case, and I apologize for pigeonholing them, but my personal experience working on certain projects was a lot of times they wouldn't do what I was trying to do. Let's say
you mean missing functionality or some feature.
I need to do band steering and it doesn't exist, or I need to do some type of radio resource management and it's not there, and the product is labeled enterprise class, but then it doesn't do what I need it to do, or it's just doing weird things. And I saw a tweet earlier today about a certain vendor's networking equipment sending, I think, 3,000 DNS requests in a second and a half, and they didn't know why it was doing it, and they had a PCAP, and it was an SMB focused vendor that I may or may not have just mentioned. So
so I'd like to change
I'm
gears.
just going to add that those kinds of weird things aren't exclusive to SMB vendors.
Not even close.
An ARP storm from hell from a leading enterprise vendor.
Oh, I agree with you 100%. And as much as I'll be the one to bash vendor support, at the same time, I can generally get on the phone with that vendor and have that really quirky thing that shouldn't have been there in the first place because I paid for this enterprise class product, but it's there. It got past QA. They do generally have the ability to dig in and figure out what it is.
And then they might point you to a firmware update.
Yeah.
Yep. If there is an update for that fixes that bug. So we're about to wrap it up. We're getting close to that point, and I want to just ask one last question and kind of keep it brief. From a career perspective, what are your thoughts about working in an SMB, and whether you're in networking or a generalist, opportunities for advancement to develop your skill set? What are your thoughts around that?
Well, in the MSP space, I love it just because in any given day I could jump from one customer to another, go from a networking issue to a VMware issue, and it's a surprise every day.
Yeah, I mean, we don't like surprises, but at the same time it's fun, and it keeps our work
you on
interesting.
your toes.
I'm jealous of you, John. I'll admit.
That was the same with me when I did it as well. My big thing was, you go from vendor to vendor, or not from vendor to vendor, client to client, day in, day out. You're getting a whole new network that you're, walking into at that point. If you are working with multiple clients, you're not actually at one small biz. But I mean, the amount of gear you'll come across and see day to day, you're going to get to touch a lot more than you would if you were at one company. You had one network to deal with. So I mean, that was definitely an advantage to it. That being said, even at that point, you would kind of get limited and you'd start seeing the same thing over and over. Like we talked about, there's a lot of SonicWalls out there. You can only see so many before you're kind of over it. But
Well, it certainly sounds like that we can identify that as a challenge, but it sounds like something that many of us look at fondly as well, as a great learning experience and something that we just enjoy as engineering nerdy type people. So that's cool. So
yeah, I wouldn't change it for the world. That experience in the SMB space is, and I was more of a generalist. So when I started, I did, servers, networks, desktop support. I mean, if it plugged into a wall, I was considered mine, right? Like that was pretty much how it worked.
I hear you.
And I learned so much. I could not, I tried to picture my career as if I had started at a bigger shop and been put into a silo right away. Yeah. Like if I had started right in networking, would I be as competent as I am today? And I would say the answer would be no.
Yeah.
Because that exposure, that experience working on and being responsible for everything, I think it precludes you from pointing the finger too quickly.
Yeah. Right? I feel like that's the true full stack engineer, is working at, is the single person wearing every hat at a 50-person company,
Yeah, we talk about it like that's the guy who's working at, eBay or Google or whatever. And the reality is we've had them all along. Yeah, it's the guy working at your community bank trying to make sure that thing stays online all the time. Yeah.
It's funny how it works, though, because I had to start similar to you, Jordan. Right? I worked for an MSP, and I did everything. And it took, after a while, I wanted to move beyond that and specialize in networking. So that's what I did. But I sort of see things come full circle, because that initial experience that, I was a generalist and I now want to be a specialist, well, all of a sudden now it's full stack. And if you look at certain hyper-converged products or just the way that a lot of the industry is going, I think a lot of that experience is more valuable now, because you really do need to tie all these products together. Yeah. So it's kind of funny, because I tried to distance myself from generalist. I want to be a specialist, and now I'm the specialist, and that generalist experience is pretty valuable. So
right, it was fun. I loved eating from the trough of nerdness, of constant Did that sound weird? I'm sorry if it did.
No, it's
perfect.
Perfect.
You know what? Oh, good. I'm glad.
Perfect.
I'll patent that or copyright it, whatever. Listen, I'm glad that we were able to end on a positive note and just say SMB, working in SMB is horrible. It sounds like there's definitely some challenges, many of them around budget. But a lot of good experiences, right? So I do want to wrap up with that. So thanks everybody for joining. Thanks everyone following on Twitter today, or rather participating in Twitter and then following the live stream. Small and medium-sized businesses, SMBs, are probably the most numerous type of businesses out there, which is why we wanted to do this show. We thought it was very relevant, and I think we really fleshed out some of those unique challenges that SMBs face. That maybe not necessarily those huge, cool, super cool web scale and hyperscale companies and service providers deal with. SMBs still have some serious IT challenges, and sometimes it's professional challenges, and those are really valuable, both personally and professionally, it sounds. So thanks again, Kevin, John, and Matt. It was really nice to have you all on the show. And I'd like to also thank, of course, Jordan and Yvonne for co-hosting again with me and all the incredible hard work that you do. And why don't you two take a moment and let us know how we can find you online. Yvonne, why don't we start with you?
I'm Yvonne Sharp. You can find me on Twitter at Sharp Network or on the blog at esharp.net.
Great. And Jordan?
So you can find me on Twitter at BCJordo. I occasionally blog at jordanmartin.net.
Awesome. Thanks, Jordan. And you can find me on Twitter using at network_Phil, and you can check out my blog at networkphil.com. So join us next on May 23rd. That's in 2 weeks at 7 p.m. Eastern Time for episode 4. We're real excited about it, called The Impact of Increasing Encrypted Traffic. We'll be focusing on the increasing pervasiveness of encrypted traffic on our networks and what that really means. So until then, thanks for watching and participating, and see you next time.